Let's get right down to, I don't know, I guess you can call it the southern White House right now with Paula Reed, White House correspondent for us. She is following the latest from Mar-a-Lago.
I've always found Paul Manafort to be a very decent man.
Paul Manafort, once a pivotal player in the 2016 Trump campaign, became one of the most prominent names in the probe into Russia's election interference. He served around 2 years in prison on tax and bank fraud charges brought by special counsel Robert Mueller. Despite being convicted by a jury and pleading guilty in his second case, the White House said Wednesday he'd been treated worse than most violent criminals. He received a full pardon. So did Roger Stone, a friend and advisor to the president who was convicted of witness tampering and lying to Congress about his communications with WikiLeaks about thousands of hacked Democratic emails. Prosecutors said he sought out WikiLeaks while maintaining regular contact with the Trump campaign.
It's been amazing what's coming out on WikiLeaks.
The White House said Stone's conviction was the result of prosecutorial misconduct. The president also pardoned the father of his son-in-law and senior advisor Jared Kushner. Charles Kushner pleaded guilty to witness retaliation and tax charges in 2005. Trump ally and former U.S. Attorney Chris Christie prosecuted the case, which involved allegations that Kushner had retaliated against his brother-in-law, a federal witness, by arranging for a prostitute to seduce him and then sending a tape of the incident to his sister.
It's one of the most loathsome, disgusting crimes that I prosecuted when I was U.S. Attorney.
Republican Senator Ben Sasse called the pardons rotten to the core. The pardons come as the president escalates tensions with Congress, vetoing a key defense spending bill and standing in the way of $600 stimulus payments to millions of Americans. Even though he remained silent throughout months of negotiations, he is now demanding payouts more than 3 times higher.
$2,000 or $4,000 for a couple.
Something Democratic leaders said the House of Representatives could vote on by noon today.
People are hurting right now. They're hurting. And we need to get the relief to them immediately.
Like furloughed flight attendant Troy Menzer.
Right now, we need the $600 stimulus checks.
The bill Congress passed has $15 billion in aid for airline workers, meaning Menzer could work again. Now that's uncertain. As he helped his cousin move Wednesday, he worried he could lose his own apartment.
It's really, really sad that a few days before Christmas, the government is still playing with our lives.
All right, so let's go now to Paula Reed, who is in West Palm Beach, Florida, covering the president as he starts this, I don't know, Paula, I guess they're calling it a working Christmas for him, right?
Small W, Jeff, but yes, that is what is expected based on the official schedule. We don't have a lot of details about exactly what he's doing.
So, as you highlighted in your piece, Americans nationwide are desperate for this financial aid. So what's going on today with this vote on the $2,000 stimulus checks, and do we know when the president intends to sign or veto this bill?
The president really threw a curveball, not just to the people waiting at home, but also his own party. Remember, it was Republicans who were the ones who were opposing these larger stimulus checks. So for the president to come out at the last minute and make this demand for larger checks, especially when he was silent virtually throughout the 6 or so months that this had been negotiated, this really surprised members of both parties. Later today, we expect that there will be an attempt by Democrats to pass something that would increase these stimulus checks. But that is expected to fail because it doesn't have what it needs, which would be unanimous support from Republicans. So once that fails, the president, he'll have a choice. He can either veto this relief bill or he can sign it. Also looming is the potential threat of a government shutdown. If the president does not sign this by Monday, the government could shut down for the 3rd time in his administration. The White House has given no indication on a timeline that the president would follow, depending on what happens this afternoon.
You know what? You have covered this White House for a long time. Can you help those of us who don't follow the White House as closely as you do, the public out there, understand, what is it behind this late process maneuver by the president? Is this something that he'd been thinking about for some time? Where did this originate from?
So if he had been thinking about it for a long time, he was certainly keeping it to himself. Throughout most of the negotiating process, he really deferred largely to his Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, and even for a time, his Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows. They were the ones doing the negotiating. Now, when the president looked at this bill, he not only objected to the size of the checks going to Americans, he also objected to some other provisions, some other relief that was included in this bill, and some other stuff that Congress was passing. But that is really not the time. Once you have a bipartisan consensus, you get a bill passed. That's not necessarily the time to make these demands, especially when this has been such a lengthy negotiating process. And you look at the arguments made by other Republicans. Mitch McConnell was doing a victory lap earlier this week. He was thrilled that he had blocked this larger proposal by Democrats, even some of the president's other allies, Senator Rand Paul. He thinks that people who are working, they shouldn't be giving these checks. So there are already so many divisions within the Republican Party over this stimulus deal. For the president to come in at the last minute when he's been silent throughout months and months and months of negotiation is really detrimental to his own party. So it's unclear if he's just trying to punish his own party or if he's just very comfortable leaving all these Americans in limbo.
Yeah, as you point out, this really does put members of his own party in a really tough situation. So let's move on to another topic, of course, the big one for a lot of people in this country as well. CBS News has learned that the White House Coronavirus Task Force will no longer automatically send state reports to state officials. So what more do we know about this? Why is this policy changing?
It's really quite surprising, Jeff, because, of course, as we know, the administration has largely deferred to local and state governments to handle the coronavirus response. And the federal government has really, in terms of leadership and direction, not provided very much guidance throughout this pandemic. Now, to make the states go and have to request specific information like this, it's just another burden for them as they are currently trying to roll out the vaccine. That's really the only place we've seen the administration be forward-leaning at all over the past week, putting out various officials, the Health and Human Services Secretary, the Surgeon General, to encourage people to get this vaccine. But one of the greatest obstacles that they have is there's a real trust deficit with this administration, with a lot of these officials, as they have repeatedly misled the public throughout this pandemic. So for them to now be the faces going out and telling people, yes, you should get this vaccine, it's unclear that's going to be a successful strategy to convert the hearts and minds of the people who are on the fence. And of course, President Trump has not yet received this vaccine. The Surgeon General told us earlier this week because the president received that monoclonal antibody therapy that he isn't supposed to get it just yet. But again, the White House not providing any details on if and when the president will get that vaccine.
One thing for sure, traditionally the news cycle is not this active around the holiday season, and we still have to talk about these pardons, you know, the pardons that have been announced this week by the White House, the president specifically. Wednesday's list involves people very close to this president's inner circle, including the father of his son-in-law. Can the president really pardon someone who's part of his extended family?
Yeah, it's interesting. His powers for clemency are broad. They are nearly absolute for federal crimes. There's no requirement. He can use this however he wants. But his choices, opting to pardon Charles Kushner for a crime that even one of his allies, Chris Christie, says was one of the most loathsome he had ever prosecuted, and of course also pardoning several of his advisors who either pleaded guilty or were convicted, or in the case of Paul Manafort, he was both convicted and pleaded guilty in the special counsel investigation. By choosing to use your power to help these people, it really does suggest that the president is most focused on those who have been loyal to him and those who are very well connected. That's a pattern we've seen throughout this administration when the president has opted to either pardon people or commute their sentences.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to address some of these questions that I'm firing at you here. I've been on the other side of this, and I know how taxing it can be sometimes. So I hope you have your running shoes on, because obviously it's probably going to be another busy day for you, right? So thank you, Paula. Happy holidays.
No doubt. Likewise. Bye, Jeff.